How did the greatest empire in the world, that extended across all of South America, fall to a country the size of California? This happened over 500 years ago, but current-day Peru is still feeling the effects of this demise. A diverse country that is crippled with political corruption and civil unrest somehow still manages to thrive in a rich, creative culture. Today, we're going to dive into the full history of Peru to understand how we got here today. I was inspired to record this podcast for multiple reasons. For one, I wanted to create and share a more informative piece of content that people can learn and grow their perspective on the world from. Also, I just love Peru's history. It is truly incredible. This isn't going to be the typical Paper Mountains podcast where I talk to my friends and family about their individual and unique perspectives on the world, nor is it going to be me talking to my wife Morgan about our specific travels around the world, similar to our previous Traveling Wellberries episodes. I've done months of research for this episode, and I've written a majority of the script to talk about the country of Peru with you today. You may have seen that Peru has been in the news recently, and not for the best of reasons. My guess is that you are still not entirely sure of what is actually going on in the country, and you might be a little intimidated about the current state of Peru. And you also might have the impression whatever is going on that it's not good. And I get that. I just hope to share some additional insight from my own research, as well as provide a full history of the country, everything from ancient Peru to pre-Columbian period to the current state of affairs that are occurring today. I truly believe that Peru is a fascinating place, that there is so much to offer for everyone, tourists, history buffs, or just curious people in general. At the time of writing this, I had no idea how long this episode was going to be, nor did I necessarily know where it was going to go. But if you're interested about learning about the complete history of Peru, or just curious on how we got here today, then come along for this ride. Having been to Peru last year, and a person who personally appreciates the rich culture and history of the country, I also wanted to learn more about what's going on there, recognize what has happened throughout the history, and be more understanding of people's situations. And if you're also interested in our other content on Peru, there's already a 4-part video series on YouTube that showcases our personal experiences and thoughts on traveling the country. Additionally, Morgan has written a number of travel guides and blogs that will help other tourists looking to experience Peru firsthand. If that's something you're interested in, then head to our YouTube channel or to our blog, The Traveling Wellberries, both of which are linked in the show notes below. And finally, another inspiration for recording this episode is that we were recently reading the book 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus, by the author Charles C. Mann. The book goes into great detail about regarding the updated information about the Americas prior to European expansion, and argues that the indigenous people of North and South America were far more developed than we previously gave credit. A portion of this book also talks about the Inca Empire and pre-Columbian Peru, both of which made a great impact on my perspective after visiting the country. So with that, welcome back to a Paper Mountains podcast, a special episode on the complete history of Peru and how we got here today. So let's dive right into it. First of all, what's going on in Peru now? On December 7th, 2022, Dina Boluarte was appointed to be the first female president of Peru. And as of recording this podcast, she still holds that title. Her presidency came to be not through the typical presidential election, but through the impeachment of the previous president, Pedro Castillo. Through a growing political polarization of the country, Pedro Castillo was elected as the 54th president of Peru in July of 2021. He was also represented by the Free Peru Political Party, which is a Marxist left-wing socialist organization that was founded in 2008. Free Peru also currently has the second most seats in Congress of Peru, with 22 out of the 130 total representatives. The political movement gained a significant support from the Peruvian people. In a close race, Castillo won the general election in 2021. Since taking office, it seemed that he was attempting to distance himself from the far left by opposing same-sex marriage and abortion legislation, and taking a slightly more conservative stance on social issues. I also feel important to note that in much of South American culture, these stances are not out of the norm. So what happened? Why was Castillo removed from office in late 2022? Since the beginning of his term, observers have cited that his political direction was being unclear and that he just generally lacked political experience. Political scientist Paula Tavera also said that his presidency had not shown any clear direction and has yet to tackle any of the promised political projects. Instead, it is sinking into chaos, with new ministers constantly being appointed, with not necessarily having any qualifications other than the party membership. In April 2022, Free Peru started to also distance themselves from Castillo by drafting a bill calling for an updated general elections to be held in 2023 to elect a new president in Congress. So, your typical politics, media propaganda, poor leadership, and unethical practices. Through all of 2022, Castillo's presidency has been accused of corruption and was already attempted to be impeached multiple times. Then on December 7, 2022, hours before the Congress of Peru was scheduled to vote on the third impeachment motion, Castillo cited that the persistent obstruction by Congress declared an immediate national curfew and the dissolution of Congress was necessary, and that there needed to be the installation of a government of exceptional emergency. This attempt of dissolution of Congress was quickly denounced as a coup attempt, and then this resulted in the quick impeachment and removal and arrest of Castillo. Currently, he has been placed in preventive detention for 18 months and faces trial for rebellion and conspiracy. Then later that same day, Dina Boluarte, Castillo's vice president, assumed head office. Through the political division, she quickly received support from the right-leaning political organizations, but she identifies as an independent and is not affiliated with any political organization. In the formation of her government cabinet, she consulted all of the major parties, but selected no members from Congress. Instead, she formed what is widely viewed as a technocratic government led by Pedro Angulo Arana, an attorney who has since faced 13 criminal investigations since his appointment in December of 2022, including abuse of authority, abuse of public administration, abuse of public faith, blackmail, extortion, and others. This might sound pretty wild to many Westerners listening, open political corruption and unstable leaders, but unfortunately to many Peruvian people, this is starting to become the current norm, as Dina Boluarte's presidency comes to a period in political turmoil in Peru that began in 2017, as she is the sixth president within the last 5 years. Due to broadly interpreted impeachment wording in the 1993 Constitution of Peru, the Congress of Peru can impeach the president without essentially any cause, effectively making the executive branch subject to legislator at any given moment. Boluarte is currently sitting at a 71% disapproval rating, and 80% of people disagree with her presidential legitimacy. As I sit here and reflect on the information that I just read, does it really sound that far from the US politics? Corruption is definitely evident in the United States. We might not have the precedents for such congressional power and a recent constitutional reform, but I know that the left-right division amongst the people and the citizens questioning the legitimacy of the transfer of power hits too close to home. Peru is recognized as a sovereign state and has a republic government structure with a multi-party system. The current republic was only recently established in 1993 under the Constitution of Peru, which replaced the 1979 Constitution. Essentially, the updated Constitution gave greater power to the president. Similar to the United States, Peru's government is composed of three branches, them being executive, judicial, and legislative. Peru really hit worldwide news in late 2022 following the presidential impeachment because of the widespread protest. These protests were in civilian support of Castillo. They unfortunately led to 48 civilians and 1 police officer dead, and then multiple military-civilian altercations. These demonstrations demanded the resignation of Boluarte, the closure of Congress, and the call for a new general election. The situation intensified when the military deployed helicopters to fire at protesters, who later tried to take over the city's airport, which was defended by the Peruvian Army and the National Police of Peru. This incident has been highly criticized by the human rights activists and deemed immoral. According to La Repubblica, sources reported that Boluarte wanted to resign from her presidency following what was being described as a massacre, though her defense minister, Alberto Atahualpa, convinced her that if she were to resign, then her and other ministers would lose their immunity and possibly be prosecuted on human rights crimes. My thoughts are that this is nothing short of a tragedy for the Peruvian people. To me, there is still no clear direction of the government. The true people who are suffering are the people of Peru. There are 34 million people who live in this country, most of which I assume are just living day to day. They aren't playing the political games, and they're just trying to get by to support their family. From what I can tell from the outside perspective, that is where Peru is today, at least from a political and government position. But what about the people? What about the citizens who live here? Because that is what truly matters, right? Well, we were in Peru in July and August of last year, and all that I can say is from the people that we met here, they were nothing but kind, and they only wish to share their country's history and culture to the world. Whether it be the hippies giving surf lessons on the coast, the world-class chefs creating some of the most delicious food that I've ever had in my life, the rock and roll loving taxi drivers, the tour guides sharing their knowledge at the endless cultural sites, or the guy selling roadside pork to me after a long bus ride to Arequipa, that may or may not have given me food poisoning for 2 months. There was only love. So to the people listening, I also wanted to share that same love and excitement for Peru's culture by going back in time and talking about some of Peru's history, and then going all the way to modern day Peru. So to start, let's go back to 10,000 BC. No, I probably don't need to go back this far, but I want to, so let's go. Peru has so many ruins from so many cultures and many small towns. Archaeological labor is a flourishing blue-collar trade. This has led to some incredible discoveries. What differentiates Peru from other ancient civilizations is that the knowledge that we do have comes almost entirely from archaeological excavation, with almost no written records surviving. Ancient Peru has been home to many successive civilizations throughout all of human history, and in this region of South America in particular, actually has one of the longest civilizational histories than any other location in the world. Current studies actually have it dated back to 10,000 BC. To our current understanding, Peru's first people were nomadic hunter-gatherers, living in caves and hunting saber-toothed tigers and mastodons. Cave paintings of these ancient people have been found in central and southern Peru. In a location just 25 miles south of current-day Lima, Peru, lies the ruins of Pachacamac. The ancient city structure was built along the Lorraine River and covers almost 1,500 acres of land. During our time in Peru, we were lucky enough to have visited these immense ruins. Pachacamac was the god who created the earth for these ancient people. Although the ruins' oldest construction has been dated nearly as 200 AD, nearby caves of the Pachacamac ruins have uncovered hunting tools that date back to more than 11,000 years ago. Little is actually known about the people of this time, as we can only study of what remains today and what has actually been uncovered. Experts need to infer the likely lives of these people because there is plenty of discussion in today's archaeological community on what types of lives these people lived during this time. It is likely that much of the people lived nomadic, hunter-gatherer lifestyles, and this information is always subject to change if new evidence is found. Now going forward in time from 6000 BC to 3000 BC. Studies show that the ancient people of Peru not only had nomadic lifestyles, but also began agricultural practices. This began with the cultivation of plants such as maize and cotton, and the domestication of llamas, alpacas, and guinea pigs. Around this time in history, they also began knitting cotton and making baskets and pottery. Peru is not only vast in ancient history, but in the landscape and geography of the country as well. It is traditionally described in terms of three main regions: the dry coast to the west, the rugged mountains of the Andes in the center, and the dense eastern rainforest of the Amazons. These different terrains have led to unique and individual development of the people here. The western coast of Peru borders the Pacific Ocean, and in this coastline was home to the oldest known civilization in the Americas, the Norte Chico. This region and culture is also documented as one of the 6 cradles of civilizations. Their culture is also known as the Cradle. Per carbon dating of the identified ruins, their civilization likely began building around 3500 BC. But before we get into the Norte Chico people, during the research for this podcast, I asked myself, what the heck is a cradle of civilization? Well, it is a location of original development where civilization, settlements, and human culture were all independently created by the humans living there. In other words, the civilization was developed with a continual improvements without any outside forces. They weren't taught to improve their way of living. The main characteristics of identifying these cultures are through confirming that they had the development of monumental structures, the existence of social classes, and that they had the creation of a writing system for communication. There are currently believed to be 6 locations of original culture. They are the Fertile Crescent of the inland Mesopotamia in the Middle Eastern region, so Iraq, Syria, and Israel. The second is the Nile Valley of Northeast Africa. The third is the Indo-Gangetic Plain of northern India. Next, the northern plains of China. The fifth, the Mesoamerican Gulf Coast, what is now Mexico. And finally, the people of the Andean coast of what is made up of Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Chile. The Norte Chico civilization built their first city, Huari, 100 miles north of present-day Lima, Peru. Since the discovery of this site, 3 large earthwork mounds exist today and are believed to be the remains of 3 pyramidal structures. Before any excavation began on the site, Peru had already laid the Pan-American Highway directly through the ruins, and the Huari site wasn't excavated until more recently because they didn't think there was any valuable gold or ceramics within the ruins, which is partially true, but since then, further excavation in 2007 has revealed that one of the structures was a temple that predates all other Peruvian architecture, giving evidence that this is the oldest known structure in all of North and South America. Additional archaeological evidence suggests that the Norte Chico people made textile fabrics and had at least the basis of some religion because of the symbology that was depicted in located artifacts. It is fascinating because these same symbols of which actually reoccur and are depicted again in later pre-Columbian indigenous cultures, insinuating that influence on later Peruvian cultures was present. Remember, we are still talking about a civilization that is in 3000 BC. I don't know about you, but this time scale is hard to comprehend for me. I've only been on this planet for 27 years, and we're talking about people who lived more than 5,000 years ago, and who have walked the same ground that we are on today. These ancient people were far more advanced than we previously gave credit. They were not simple nomadic people. They were building pyramids that predate the Great Pyramids of Giza in Egypt. So there is definitely something worth appreciating. There is even evidence that they continued to advance their agricultural practices to further domesticate plants such as maize, squash, guava, sweet potato, and avocado. They built widespread irrigation systems for farming because remember, they're basically in a desert along the coast, fished the Pacific coastline for clams, mussels, anchovies, and sardines, and they even played music with handmade flutes. The Norte Chico people likely developed a political system that helped them govern and manage their population. But what really sets the Norte Chico people apart from the other beginning civilizations is the fact that they were cultivating cotton. Why would a civilization that essentially lives in the desert be focused on growing cotton at this time in history? Wouldn't it make more sense if they were focused on agriculture solely for food? Well, the evidence shows us that cotton was grown by the Norte Chico because they began a trade system with other coastal fishing communities who needed the cotton to make fishing nets. To establish a trade system, there needed to be some governing or hierarchical systems that enforced and established specific roles within their society. The Norte Chico culture was truly a first of its kind. If nothing described thus far has impressed you to describe the Norte Chico people as an advanced civilization, well, first I would ask you, have you actually been listening? But if you still aren't budging on your position, then this next topic has to impress you. Have you ever heard of a Quipu? They are historic writing devices created from strings that utilize associated knots in various string color along one larger bass string that is used to count, teach, understand mathematics, record inventory, or document information. Quipus were used by many cultures of ancient South America. The Norte Chico people were no exception, and they started using these around 2600 BC. These devices continued to improve throughout pre-Columbian South American history as well. And we'll talk more about them when we get to the Inca Empire, because the research has focused on a much larger sample set of a few hundred Quipu dating to the Incan times. The Quipus of the Norte Chico discovery remain more singular and mostly undeciphered. It is safe to say that the Norte Chico, or the Corral Supe, were intelligent in their own right. When compared to similar civilizations throughout history, the Norte Chico people are very unique. They had a complete lack of ceramics. From what experts can tell, they didn't even develop any. Their crops were cooked solely by roasting, and the pottery lacked any apparent visual arts, sculptures, or carvings. The only items we have today are large mounds and remnants of textile fabrics. I sit here and ponder on these ancient people. Why did they have such little art in their culture? Were they too preoccupied with farming, building, and just surviving? If so, why did they spend so much time building these massive pyramids and such large structures? These structures of Huaca are some of the oldest known to mankind, and all that we can do is interpret and assume. We will never know the true lives of these people, but it is truly fascinating to think and guess what life was like for them. By the year 1800 BC, the Norte Chico people are beginning to decline in power. Other civilizations began to arise and take prominence in southern, northern, and the Andean parts of Peru. It is believed that the Norte Chico people were in decline because more extensive and practical irrigation systems were being developed further north in Peru. People were just moving to more fertile ground, which had better agriculture production. And as it goes and looking back, it almost seems inevitable. The ancient Peruvian people began to spread inland, to form and join new groups. These new groups became known as the Chavín, the Moche, and the Nazca people. But it would almost take 1,000 years for the next great Peruvian civilization to take hold. And from here, I'm going to refer to this time period as the Pre-Columbian, pre-Christopher Columbus, pre-Spanish Conquistadors. I know that technically everything that we've discussed up to this point is also pre-Columbian, but for the sake of grouping and categorizing the chapters for this podcast, I've referred to everything up to this point as ancient Peru. It seems odd to make this large of a time jump in history, but I can only share information on what I find online. This section of the podcast begins at 1000 BC, and it seems kind of sad that we're just skipping over almost 1,000 years of human history, 1,000 years of humans basically forgotten. We know they existed, but we'll never know what they were like and why the progress slowed down so much since the rise of the Norte Chicos. Maybe there were significant droughts, major flooding, or people were just living more self-sufficient lives. If so, why? Regardless, from this point, it is where the historical and cultural documentation becomes more well-known and understood by us today. The human story of Peru is now taken over by the Chavín culture. They developed their civilization in the Andean mountains of northern Peru, nearly 250 miles north of present-day Lima. Their prominence takes hold and is understood by modern-day historians because they are categorized as the initial major religious society of Peru, who left behind much of their culture to study. The Chavín culture show us the first appearance of ceramics and metallurgy development, and even made the further agricultural improvements. It is unsure in the exact origin of the Chavín culture, but the best-known archaeological site is the Chavín de Huántar, located in the present-day Ancash region. It can't be understated how important the site is to understanding pre-Columbian culture within Peru. The Huantar site was designated as an UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1985. UNESCO is an acronym for the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. It was formed in 1972 and is a specialized agency of the United Nations aimed at promoting world peace and security through the international cooperation in education, art sciences, and culture. They have a goal of preserving important ancient sites. Currently, Peru has 12 different sites inscribed in the World Heritage List. But why is the Chavín de Huántar location so significant? The extensive architecture here is considered an engineering accomplishment for its time. The interior of the buildings were so complex. They included galleries, passageways, staircases, ventilations, and even drainage systems, all of which did not exist in pre-Columbian Peru until now. The remains show us that there were two main temples constructed here over the course from 900 BC to 200 BC. They needed to implement extensive drainage and canal systems here because they understood that major annual flooding would have likely destroyed the temples. With a strict attention to detail in mind, everything was built in complete symmetry too. But keep listening, it gets even crazier. The temples were built with white granite and black limestone. Neither of these minerals were found naturally at the site, and this meant that all of the materials for the temples needed to be brought in from other locations. But what really makes the site fascinating to me is that it essentially completely lacks any residential structures. The focus was completely on the temple construction. Where did everyone else live that worked for hundreds of years constructing these temples? Why did they only build these temples? And similarly, why did all ancient cultures spend so much time building these massive structures? Similar patterns have occurred over and over again all around the world. These again are things we'll never know but can only speculate. Anyway, the year is 500 BC, and the development really ramps up here in Peruvian history. This likely cause can be attributed to the extensive trade networks among the various groups within Peru. With this trade network, people could begin to specialize their tasks, and society could take off while everyone is working as a common unit in the goal of having a better life. The main export for trade from the Chavín culture at this time was dried llama meat, potatoes, quinoa, maize, ceramic pottery, and gold. The Chavín culture understood metallurgy and began smoldering to produce what we now know as refined gold. You know, the stuff that the Spanish went insane over when they came to the Americas in another 1,000 years from now. Peru and other parts of South America had an abundance of this rare mineral. For the Chavín people, gold was used to create crowns and jewelry, likely to show status and power to the leaders. The remains from the Chavín gold production are now preserved in Lima, Peru's Gold Museum. Okay, so we have architecture, trade, agriculture, and gold. What else did the Chavín culture push forward that the Norte Chico did not? And what sets them apart? Well, it's the thing that people appreciate most in today while looking back at history. It's art. The Chavín art was incredible, widespread, and very recognizable. The art is known for its complex iconography and its mythical realism. There was consistent development in their art that included humanoid animal creatures. This shows us today that the reflection on societal interconnections and how the Chavín people viewed themselves, connected with the natural world and also had a connectivity to the other world. They were very spiritual people. Chavín art is depicted everywhere, along the walls of their temples, carvings in bones and stone, sculptures and pottery. It was just everywhere. Jaguars and eagles were their favorite depictions. They likely worshipped these creatures and believed that they had special connections to the spiritual world. Studies show us that there was a wide influence on Chavín art because the ceramics and same depictions have been found throughout all of Peru. So why was art created? Why did it exist? Why was there a strict religion and spirituality formed? These are questions that we ask today about the past that we take for granted in today's culture. Because why wouldn't art exist? Why wouldn't religion be here today? It always has. But there's infinite experts ready to exert their opinions as fact to these questions, but that's all that they are, opinions. One opinion that I found that I at least found fun and intriguing is the explanation through drugs. Similar to the stoned ape theory, of which I'm not going to go into today, you can do your own research on that rabbit hole. But what also emerges in the Chavín culture, along with the origination of art, is the depictions of psychoactive plant consumption, snuff, and psychedelic drugs. I'm not saying this is the reason for art, spirituality, and religion, but it's pretty believable, right? While all of this crazy development, widespread trading, creation of art was happening by the Chavín culture, it appears warfare was not a part of their society. The archaeological evidence shows us that there is a really lack of basic defensive structures, and warriors are not depicted in any of their art. Maybe they had an effective control in the population through religion, where fear was used by the hierarchical religious leaders, or that there was just not a need for war because of the increased prosperity through trade. Regardless, they appear to have a pretty mostly peaceful society. To go into the Chavín religion a little bit, it shows us that they had a high interest in binaries and manipulating them: men and women, sun and the moon, sky and water. These are opposites that were believed to bring balance to each other, and they are often depicted together in artwork. The architecture shows that there was a widespread ritualist practice and spaces for the entire community. Shamans existed at this time, as they were the religious leaders who were believed to be able to make a connection between the human world and the spiritual world. They demonstrated skills in understanding the supernatural world with the ability to manipulate it, thus making them stand out as a religious figure. But what were their rituals like? There is no proof of human sacrifice or sacrificial ceremonies in their religion either. There is much to speculate on the Chavín religion, but it is understood and well accepted that the Chavín were inclusive in their ritual practices and was practiced by the entire culture. Despite all of this miraculous achievements, religious and creative developments, the Chavín culture entered into their decline around 250 BC. Nobody really knows why. The reasons remain unclear to us, similar to the Norte Chico decline. But it is speculated that there were several years of drought and earthquakes that ultimately brought stress to the population and the demise of the civilization. There is no evidence of military or conquest, so their end remains mysterious to us. What we do know is that they made a lasting legacy in architecture and art to subsequent Peruvian civilizations. So let's move to the coastal desert of Peru. Simultaneously, while the development in northern Andean Peru is occurring, there was something else happening in the Casma Sechin Basin, almost near where the once Norte Chico people thrived. There begins not only a fascination, but a vast understanding of astrological movements. This was recognized by the development of the Chankillo complex, where construction is dated around 350 BC and is attributed to the later Casma Sechin culture of that period. So what was the Chankillo complex? In simplistic terms, it is a giant observatory and calendar. It is everything but simple. The design and construction of the complex is a long north to south line of 13 towers that stretch along a natural ridge, with 2 subsequent observation areas on each side. From the observation points, the 13 towers lie precisely to mark the solar rising and setting points throughout the entire year. The towers assisted the Casma Sechin culture in understanding the time of solstices, equinoxes, and the time of the year within an accuracy of 1 to 2 days. Surrounding the towers includes a triple-walled fortified temple. Although it was built to stand the test of time, the complex was partially destroyed and abandoned by the year 200 BC. But the remains live on as a significant piece to Pre-Columbian native Peruvian history. It shows us the initial stages in major astronomical understanding and innovations of the Americas. While writing this section of the podcast, YouTuber Joe Sky actually just released a fascinating 13-minute video on the Chankillo complex. If you're interested, the video is linked below in the show notes. Okay, I know most people have made it this far in the episode are on their edge of their seats, wondering when the heck I'm going to talk about the Incas. Don't worry, we're almost to the greatest South American indigenous empire in history. We're so close, but not yet, just hold on. Let's first talk about the Nazca and Moche cultures. The Nazca and the Moche cultures came to prominence in the year 100 BC and flourished until 800 AD. The Nazca society followed the Paracas culture and thrived in the dry deserts of southern Peru, of what is now around 260 miles south of present-day Lima, while the Moche people were spread across the northwestern coast of Peru. Nazca culture is known for their extremely complex textiles, tools, immense aqueduct systems, intricate pottery and ceramics, and of course, their geoglyphs, for which is the main reason why I want to talk about this culture. I mean, have you heard of the Nazca lines? If you haven't, I urge you to go to Google right now, search the Nazca lines of Peru, because they are truly incredible, and I guarantee you'll be blown away by these geoglyphs. So the Nazca religious beliefs were based upon agriculture and fertility, which makes sense being surrounded in a giant desert. Agriculture was likely an imperative for their health and well-being. Much of the Nazca art depicts powerful nature gods, such as the killer whale, which indicates knowledge of a deeper ocean, harvesters, the mythical spotted cat, and the serpentine human-like creature, the most prevalent of worship figures. Again, just like the Chavín culture from earlier Peruvian history, the Nazca shamans likely used hallucinogenic drugs from the San Pedro cactus to induce visions. What I had no idea before going into this podcast is that unlike the Chavín culture, the Nazca people were believed to be a little more brutal with their weaponry and with the coined term by archaeologist Max Uhl, their trophy heads. Yes, trophy heads. Well, the Nazca people would physically wear decapitated human heads, known as trophy heads, in their religious rituals, and they would often correspond to trophies of warfare. And to all of pre-Columbian history, this decapitation tactic is completely unique to the Nazca culture. Over 100 mummified decapitated heads have been found in their ruins. So to go back a little less graphic than decapitated heads, we're going to talk more about the Nazca lines. The Nazca lines are what this culture is mostly known for because these geoglyphs still exist. You can fly to Peru right now and see these figures today that were created over 1,000 years ago. These geometric shapes are extremely large, miles of lines constructed on the desert floor in the Nazca region. And they are believed to have been constructed by large coordinated work groups of numerous people over an extended period of time, indicating a complex culture that could organize such projects. Luckily for us, the dry desert environment has preserved these lines for hundreds of years. The purpose of the lines continues to be debated today. Some researchers theorize that they were created for the gods to look upon them from above, while others suggest that they are just some sort of calendar with astronomical alignments that would aid in planting and harvesting of other crops. Other people have even thought the lines to be pathways for important ceremonial processions. These lines have been studied by experts from several disciplines, anthropologists, archaeologists, and astronomers, but none have found a conclusive evidence for any of these theories as to the purpose. Regardless, no one can argue that they aren't an incredible construction that would require a significant understanding of math and geometry. At the exact time that the Nazca people were making large-scale geoglyphs and wearing decapitated heads, the Moche culture was thriving along the northern coast of Peru. Similar to all their predecessors and contemporaries, the Moche society was agriculturally based and further built their sophisticated irrigation canals. The Moche artifacts that remain today show us a culture of hunting, fishing, fighting, sacrifice, sexuality, and elaborate ceremonies. The Moche culture had shared ideology that occupied 250 miles of desert coastline that was as far as 50 miles inland. Their influence was significant. They created thousands of ceramics that still exist today. They elevated the pre-Columbian gold production and had an extensive trade network with inland cultures. But what other legacies did the Moche people leave us? Well, for one, they constructed the largest pre-Columbian structure known as the Huaca del Sol. It was a pyramid made of adobe brick that was partly destroyed by the Spanish conquistadors, who looted its graves for gold in the 16th century. Their nearby pyramid, Huaca de la Luna, that is just as impressive, has been better preserved. This site has been under professional archaeological excavation since the 1990s. Museo Larco in Lima was one of our favorite museums that we visited last July. It is filled with over 5,000 years of Peruvian history and artifacts from their art, religious items, jewelry, and agricultural tools. They even have an entire showroom dedicated to the uncovered Moche ceramics. All of the ceramics in the showroom depict sexual acts. The Moche culture obviously had a fascination with sex, specifically anal sex. While on the tour, it was detailed that it was likely because the act could have been a spiritual practice, an act to connect to the other world, because anal sex was viewed as the opposite to the quote-unquote normal sexual act. And remember, when I mentioned pre-Columbian cultures like the Chavín having a high interest in binaries, this was no different for the Moche culture. The normal world and the underworld. Well, except having an annual holiday specifically dedicated to anal sex is a bit different, but who am I to judge? Hollywood and traditional American perspective has for sure corrupted our minds on indigenous and Native American culture. Because I've been reading, researching, and watching videos on ancient and pre-Columbian Peru for multiple weeks at this point, and I keep asking myself the same question. I swear there has to be some evidence of the practice of human sacrifice, right? It's something that I feel like I assumed happened throughout all of Peru's history, but I couldn't find it anywhere up to this point. Maybe it is tied more to the Aztecs and the Mesoamerican history. Well, I kept coming up short in my findings until now. The Moche culture is the first prominent evidence that I can tell where they practice human sacrifice in their religious practices. This ritual appears to have an elite figure with other costume participants, usually in a monumental setting, where the people would consume the blood of their victim or the martyr. Sounds a bit similar to the Christian practice of drinking blood of Christ, right? Well, for the Peru history, there is a disagreement among scholars who would be the sacrificial victims. Some argue that they were the losers of ritual battles among local elites. Others suggest that the sacrificial victims were warriors captured in territorial battles between the Moche and other nearby societies. Regardless of purpose, experts agree that this practice did take place in the Moche religion, typically by using a tumi, a crescent-shaped metal knife. While the Nazca and Moche cultures thrived for hundreds of years simultaneously, maybe not necessarily harmoniously, but both show a decline in the same period, around 500 AD. Both cultures had, of what appears to us as an insane practices that included, but not limited to, geoglyphs, decapitation, sexual exploration, human sacrifice, and immense architecture. Why did they all collapse yet again? Well, studies of ice cores drilled from glaciers in the Andes reveal major climatic events between the year 500 and 600 AD, possibly a super El Nino event that resulted in 30 years of immense flooding, followed by 30 years of drought. There are multiple theories of what brought the ultimate demise to the Nazca and Moche cultures, but it can't be argued that this environmental event didn't put significant stress on their cultures by disrupting their irrigation, agricultural practices, and political structures. By the year 750 AD, both cultures had fallen completely. So here we are, the Inca Empire, and what a lot of people don't realize is that the Incas were a relatively recent society. Well, recent in terms of history, but maybe not in terms of human conceptualization, because it is nearly impossible to conceive something like 800 years, but the year is 1200 AD. Wait, are we just going to skip over another 400 years of Peruvian history? Well, no we aren't, because we have one more civilization to go into before we talk about the Incas. But hear me out, it's very important that we talk about their culture. They were pivotal in the early frameworks and for the establishment of the Inca Empire. This civilization is known as the Wari culture. And they began to emerge in prominence in the year 500 AD as the Nazca and Moche cultures were in decline. They flourished throughout what is today almost all of the Andean and coastal Peru. They were a giant expansionist culture, of which the Incas learned from. The Wari were not afraid of combat. They conquered many smaller Peruvian cultures and assimilated them into their own. Archaeological evidence shows us that the Wari Empire maintained their capital near present-day Ayacucho and began their initial expansion by taking control of a number of smaller villages in Peru's Catahuaso Valley in approximately 600 AD. Remember early on when we discussed the Pachacamac ruins near Lima? Well, the Wari expanded into that territory as well and maintained control over the sacred site. In the great architecture of the Moche and Nazca sites, the year is roughly 800 AD and the Wari have dominance there too. They were on a mission of some serious expansion. But what was the Wari government structure like? How could they grow so quickly and maintain control over such a large amount of land? Long story short is, we don't know. Little is actually known about their governance. But what we do know is that they had a strong military force that allowed them to expand across Peru. And in 2013, we did gain additional insight when the royal Wari tomb was uncovered. 3 royal women were found and were buried with significant material wealth accompanying them. With some speculation from this, the Wari likely dominated their power using material wealth as leverage. Other burial sites from the Wari culture have been investigated, and evidence shows a clear class system was present that had servants, peasants, middle class, etc. But what is particularly interesting from these burial site investigations is that in a random selection of burials, 26% of both male and female adult skulls studied had at least one wound on the back side of the head, while only females had been subjected to wounds on the front of the skull. The different levels of violence based on sex is evidence of some type of systemic hierarchy. The same difficult weather patterns and severe droughts that brought the end to the Nazca and Moche cultures definitely brought pain to the Wari culture as well. But they had invented a practice that helped them survive in the mountains of Peru. This practice is now known as terrace farming. Terrace farming is the effort to rearrange hills and mountainside into farmland by constructing several specified ridge platforms. Each platform is called a terrace. While their unique farming practices and vast expansion throughout Peru prolonged their prominence, their ability to control their large civilization faded over the next 200 years. Archaeological evidence shows significant levels of interpersonal violence, suggesting that warfare and raiding increased amongst the rival groups upon the collapse of the Wari state structure. And here we are, seriously this time, the Great Incan Empire, or more accurately named Tawantinsuyu, but for simplicity's sake, we'll refer to them as the Incas as well. It's the final chapter in thousands of years of indigenous Andean civilizations, the culmination of 9,000 years of development, human history, agriculture, and most importantly, knowledge. The Incas are arguably one of the most important Peruvian cultures. They began their rise in the early 1200s following the Wari culture of Piura and the Tiwanaku culture of Lake Titicaca in present-day Bolivia. Their society was based in present-day Cusco, Peru. Originally, they were a relatively small kingdom of whom adopted much of their social practices and political structures from the early Andean cultures. But in the year 1438, the game changed, and the Incas decided to take the playbook from the Wari civilization. Inca rulers began to conquer neighboring territories and cultures, and they did so fast. This process continued for many years, eventually creating the largest empire in the Western Hemisphere. And I could talk about the Incas all day. They are a truly fascinating culture, but I'm going to try to constrain myself because we still need to discuss the Spanish conquistadors, independence, and the modern-day governments of Peru. So let's go to the beginning of the Incas. Let's try to understand how a once culture of agriculture and llama domestication became the largest pre-Columbian empire to ever exist in the Americas. As we mentioned earlier, the Inca referred to their own empire as the Tawantinsuyu. But what does that mean? In Quechua, their native language of the Incas, Tawa means four, Chin meaning group, and Suyu meaning provinces. So taken together, the four grouped provinces. The word is quite literal in meaning. The Incas were the co-aligned regions of Peru: the north, the Amazonian, the south, and the coast. In Quechua, the term Inca actually translates to noble. Incas were actually just the noble family of the Tawantinsuyu Empire, and it is estimated at the height of the Inca Empire, there were over 10 million subjects. That is insane. Some estimates even put the number closer to 30 million. Regardless, around 20,000 people in the entire population were considered to be nobles or Incas. What is very unique to Peru in comparison to other countries in the Western Hemisphere is that there is still a large portion of people who still speak their native language, Quechua. In places like Cusco, we met some older locals who solely spoke Quechua and didn't even know Spanish. Again, the Incas quote-unquote inherited their capital Cusco from their predecessor, the Wari. And up to this point in history, we know that major architecture has been established, countrywide irrigation systems have been developed and utilized, widespread alpaca domestication has occurred, and thanks to the Wari culture, thousands of miles of cross-country roadways were in use. Dozens of large administrative buildings and centers were already built in Cusco, and terraced mountainside farming filled the Andes. This was the launching zone that the Incas needed to expand their empire. Everything was in place at the right time. Peruvian oral history tells us the origin of the Incas. There were 3 caves at Lake Titicaca. From one cave came a family of 4 brothers and 4 sisters. And from the second and third caves came all of the people who were the ancestors from all of the Incan clans in Peru. The 8 siblings were considered to be the original noble family, on their path to follow their staff god, of whom they worshipped, to find a home for all of the Inca people. They traveled long and far and eventually arrived in Cusco. At this point, only one of the brothers remained, A.R. Manco, also known as Manco Inca. He and his 4 sisters fought for the land and won. It is said that he and his sisters built the first Inca homes in the valley with their own hands and were recognized as the founders of the Inca civilization. As time passed, the son of Manco Inca, Sinchi Roca, also known as Roca Inca, became the second emperor. The noble family grew and grew over time, mostly because they would have so many children every generation. The Incas took bloodlines very seriously, as to become emperor, that person needed to have a direct lineage back to A.R. Manco, their original ruler. However, the access to become the next emperor was not linked to the inheritance of the eldest son, as it was for the monarchy like European countries. Any Incan from any noble family could contest for the throne, but to actually become emperor, they needed to be selected from the gods themselves by means of rigorous challenges to which the physical and moral status of the pretender was tested. These trials were accompanied by a complex spiritual ritual through which the sun god Inchi would nominate the one who should assume the position. Eventually, with the passage of time, Incas named their favorite son as a co-governor with the intention of securing his succession. And sometimes the emperor's primary wife, also known as the Koya, and notice that I said primary because they would have many, many wives, had a significant influence making the decision of which son should succeed his father. It is understandable to see some flaws in the system for the next emperor, right? This process just invited a violent scramble for the prized throne between the potentially many sons of the Inca from his 20 wives, mistresses, and concubines. All of the sons essentially had equal rights to the throne as well, and they sometimes bitterly disputed who would succeed, to the extent that even bloody assassination of rivals was not overlooked. So in later Incan culture, the decision was made that only sons of the Koya, the first wife of the Inca, would be able to succeed the throne to avoid internal conflict. Foreshadowing alert, this didn't help. But this change in culture did bring additional challenges, because the practice of the Inca marrying his own sister as the Koya arose to further strengthen the claim to the next throne. If an Inca were to conceive with his own sister, this would vastly reduce the chances of conflict after the death of the Inca, as the claim to the throne would be much stronger for the sons who had 2 parents with royal blood. I'm definitely making some assumptions here, But George R. R. Martin definitely got some of this information from the Incas for his books, right? So with a religion-rich culture and the foundation laid for expansion, it took a few generations, but the Inca began their expansion. Tupac Inca began his conquest through northern Peru to expand the empire under the rule of his father in the year 1463. He continued his conquest to the north until he became the 10th emperor in the Inca succession in 1471. The Incas continued to conquer and expand for the next 40 years. During this process, the Inca ruler would send spies to the new regions that he wanted to expand upon. The spies would return with information on political organization, military strength, and the amount of wealth they held. After acquiring this information, the Incas would send messages to the native leaders explaining the benefits of joining the great empire and offering abundance of food, luxury goods, textiles, and most importantly, the fact that their people would be more rich as subjects under the Incan Empire. Most of the time this would work. They could assimilate very easily, but sometimes the regions would refuse, and then it ultimately resulted in a military conquest. In the latter process, the Incas would take the current leaders and publicly execute them. The now executed rulers' children were then brought to Cusco to learn about the Inca systems, and then they would be allowed to return to their native lands and rule under the Inca Empire. This allowed the Incas to indoctrinate their new subjects. At its height, the Inca Empire included all of modern-day Peru, western and south-central Bolivia, most of Ecuador, southwest Colombia, a large portion of modern-day Chile, and northwest Argentina. It is agreed that most of the Inca conquests were made during the late 15th century, and one could easily suspect that ruling over these many lands and cultures would not have been easy. The Inca Empire was a mix of many languages, cultures, and people. The components were not necessarily loyal either, or fully integrated, but the empire as a whole managed an economy based on exchange and taxation of goods and labors. Their system revolved around reciprocity and redistribution. Villages at different times would be required to fulfill the necessary labor and goods to support the other villages that were not producing. Maybe it was because of weather, seasonal changes, or they were focused on supporting building architecture or roadways for the empire. The taxes that were imposed from the ruling class were implementing a labor obligation for the empire. In a sense, the Incas managed a socialized welfare system where different locations would take on the rotational means of labor for other parts of the society. The empire functioned largely without money and without markets. The Inca rulers, who theoretically owned all means of production, reciprocated their profits by granting access to the lands and goods for their subjects. 3 moral laws were instilled in their culture: do not steal, do not lie, and do not be lazy. Sounds crazy, right? Well, it gets even crazier. Unlike their contemporary societies of Mesoamerica, the Inca, just like all of other pre-Columbian predecessor civilizations, they had no official language in writing. The iconography or symbols on their ceramics served as a means of communication. It seems impossible to share ideas, concepts, or learn without a written language. It's crazy to imagine. One anthropologist wrote that the Incas were able to construct one of the greatest imperial states in human history without the use of a single wheel, draft animals like a horse or an oxen, knowledge of iron or steel, or even implement an effective system of writing. It's absolutely insane. What they did utilize and improve upon was the Quipu. Remember the Quipu, the form of record keeping and writing through knots? Well, the Inca recorded information on a collection of knotted strings known as the Quipu, just as the Norte Chico did. The Quipu system operated as both a method of calculation and social organization, regulating a regional governance and tracking land use. Unfortunately, the Quipus can no longer be decoded. Originally, it was thought that they were solely used as the mnemonic devices to record numerical data, but it is also believed that they were used to record history and literature as well. In the early years of the Spanish conquest, Spanish officials often had to rely on the Quipus to settle disputes over payments or goods productions. We could know much more about the Incan culture, language, and the Quipu complexity, and even, for that matter, of the Norte Chico as well. But unfortunately, the Spanish authorities suppressed the use of quipus, and Christian officials banned and ordered the burning of all quipus in 1583 because they were used to record offerings to non-Christian gods and were therefore considered to be a false idol worshipping object and an obstacle to religious conversion. Gosh, why did the conquistadors have to suck so bad? So it has me wondering, what was this false idol religion actually like? Well, to start things off, the Incas were polytheistic. So that's a strike number 1 by the Catholic Spaniards. The Incas believed that the universe was created by Viracocha and the sun was created by Inchi. These were the two most important gods of worship, and it was believed that Viracocha created all of humanity in the middle of Lake Titicaca. And legend has it that when men were originally created, the gods were very disappointed because all of the men were hubris and greedy. So the creator then summoned the great flood to destroy the land and all of the life except for the three men who would be able to help create humans again. You know, the story might even have hidden truths in it that are actually describing the great floods that wiped out the earlier Peruvian civilizations. Again, as compelling as a theory this may be, it is only speculation. Their god creator was typically personified as a strong male figure and was said to teach people how to live. Actually, when the conquistadors originally arrived to Peru, the Incas believed that these men were sent here by Viracocha himself, and that was a major mistake. Similar to Christian belief, the Incas believed in the Holy Trinity, the Creator, the Son, and the Rain. As for Christianity, it was the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Religious similarities across the world and history fascinates me, and that conversation could be an entire podcast in itself. But outside of the universe, the sun, and the rain gods, the Incas also worshipped all kinds of deities. Mama Kia for the Mother Moon, Pachamama for Mother Earth, Mama Cocha for Mother of Lakes, and other various star cosmology constellation deities, which demonstrates their connection to the world and understanding of the universe. With their connection to the natural world, the Incas also believed everything had a parallel supernatural spirit. People, humans, objects, and even places. Everything. This was known as a Huaca. The size of the Huaca determined how much power it had. For example, mountains were considered to have some of the most powerful Huacas. This could explain their reasoning for constructing civilizations high in the Andean mountains, such as Cusco and Machu Picchu. I initially was going to leave this section out of the podcast, but since it is becoming more of a mainstream conversation, and I thought, why not leave it in? So how did the Incas connect with the supernatural world that they believed in? As it was for the earlier Chavín and Nazca cultures, the Incas continued their practice of consuming psychoactive substances and having dedicated shamans help guide their people with spiritual journeys. Inca remnants have offered us today the first official documentation of ayahuasca, which is a plant-based psychedelic that affects all of the senses and alters a person's thinking, sense of time, and emotions. This drug wasn't used recreationally though, it was used ceremoniously, as a spiritual medicine that could help people see into the religious world and understand the connectivity of the universe. What is actually most fascinating about ayahuasca is the ingredients and how it is made, which is done so by blowing the Banisteropsis caapi vine with the Psychotria verdis shrub. Okay, so what? Well, the Psychotria verdis shrub that contains the psychoactive chemical that will only elicit the psychedelic effect from human consumption when it is specifically boiled with the Banisteropsis caapi vine, because it inhibits the bodily reaction to remove the chemical. And the original habitat for these plants grow in separate ecosystems. It would be absolutely incredible to understand how the indigenous people knew to brew and consume this drink. But earliest official evidence of ayahuasca dates back to 1000 AD, as bundles of the ingredients were found in western Bolivia, and the term ayahuasca is actually a Quechua term from the Inca language. Christian missionaries from the 16th century have documented encounters of indigenous drinking ayahuasca, and they marked it as the work of the devil. Historically, it has been used for religious purposes in South America, but now in Western culture, the drug is being experimented in the pharmaceutical industry as an antidepressant and other mental health applications. If you want to listen to other people talk about this drug, basically tune into any Joe Rogan podcast and you'll be sure to hear the term DMT. But Tim Ferriss also has some fascinating podcasts out there discussing the modern applications for ayahuasca. Okay, so where were we? Back to the Incas. As we said earlier, the empire expanded and there remained many forms of local worship. To help assimilate other religions and culture, the Incas often accepted other forms of deities to worship that would also expand their own religious beliefs. But it was encouraged that the new Inca members that the strongest gods among them were the Creator, the Sun, and the Rain. This shows how wide an influence the Inca religion actually was from earlier Peruvian culture. For example, Pachamama, goddess of earth, was long worshipped before the Incas even came around. Just like earlier cultures, the Inca were obsessed with duality, the two realms of man, the upper world of which consisted of the sun, the moon, and the stars, in the underworld of the earth, where the Incan ancestors came from. This led to their fascination with the sun movements, seasonal changes, and astronomy, much of which could have been learned from earlier civilizations like the Casma Sechin. Architecture in places like Machu Picchu were built with extreme precision. Windows were placed at exact positioning of changing solstices. Walls were constructed to be exact replicas of mountains in the horizon. It is just incredible to see their constructions. The Inca civilization was the only early culture in the world that defined constellations of both light and darkness. They also assigned each star to have a purpose in their religion, and astronomy was used for agriculture purposes. For example, Cusco lies on a radial plane that mimics the sky and points to specific astronomical events. The Waris and Incas built carefully placed pillars overlooking Cusco, so when the sun rose or set between these pillars, they knew that they should begin to plant certain rotating agricultural crops at specific elevations. Constellations were followed, and animal mythology was applied to the stars. Stars, solstices, god creation, and the worship of many deities. How else did the Incas practice religion? Well, just like the earlier Moche culture, the Incas would also perform human sacrifices. Everyone in today's world can unanimously agree that this act is barbaric and unfathomable in today's culture, but why wasn't it for the Incas as well? They were well able to expand their ideology across all of Western South America, cultivate complex terrace farming, construct an impressive network of roadways and architecture, and had the ability to contemplate human morals. Why would human sacrifice still be in their culture? Well, the reason is assumed to be because of their inability to explain certain natural events. And they lived among a region of the world that is subjugated to many unfortunate natural events. Volcano eruptions, frequent seismic activity, and earthquakes, common El Niño flooding, and harsh weather patterns among the high Andean mountain ranges. And we are a culture that can't explain these conditions that are happening to you or your subjects. You resort to religion for an explanation. And remember, the Incas had a deity for about every natural event. And if these events were non-favorable to your success, the gods were angry with you. The Incas believed to regain their favor among the gods that they would have to sacrifice the most worthy contestants. Unfortunately for our perspective, the worst kind, children. They believed in an afterlife and that the children that they sacrificed would inhabit a better and more abundantly provided for world. Multiple mummified Incan girls were found among the Andean volcanoes in the late 1990s. They were determined to be the result of human sacrifice because they were surrounded in precious goods and other objects believed to be additional offerings, including ceramic vessels, figurines made from gold and silver, and intricately decorated textiles. So obviously the Inca Empire was a very religious state with some harsh ideology and beliefs. But as we already know, they didn't only practice religion and conquer to expand their empire to impose their religious beliefs, they built as well, and they built a lot, much of which were mountaintop citadels, and the one being the most famous, Machu Picchu. I can't even begin to explain the breathtaking ruins that exist among the cloud forests that are known as Machu Picchu. If you haven't already seen them for yourself, go check out our YouTube video or read our Traveling Wellberries blog about this place, because we captured some incredible footage and photos. My gosh, as we wandered amongst the Machu Picchu, it made us feel like we were walking into a different time. You just have to respect the sheer amount of intelligence that went into building places like this. Machu Picchu lies at a mountaintop of 8,000 feet in the Andes Mountains, and as we discussed earlier, parts of the construction have exact precision that align with astronomical movements. Perfectly built walls and corridors were fashioned of granite blocks, of some that weighed more than 50 tons. Impressive is an understatement. There is no written records of the site either, so it is unsure of why it was originally constructed. Of most recently, archaeologists believe that it was constructed for an estate for the Inca Emperor Pachacuti, the predecessor to Tupac Inca, the Conqueror. The site was inhabited by 750 people. It had complex drainage and canal systems accompanied the site. Terraced farming is found here as well, and expansion was planned, but construction halted in 1532 when the Spanish conquistadors arrived. It is incredible because when you visit the site today, you can even witness the abrupt halting of construction. Wars led to the eventual complete abandonment of the site. Machu Picchu is often referred to as the lost city of the Incas because it wasn't rediscovered until 1911 by American historian and explorer Hiram Bingham. He traveled to the region looking for the old Inca capital and was led to Machu Picchu by a local villager. Bingham found the name Agustin Lizarraga and the date 1902 written in charcoal on one of the walls. Though Bingham was not the first to visit the ruins, he was considered the scientific discoverer who brought Machu Picchu to the international attention. Bingham organized another expedition in 1912 to undertake major clearing and excavation. What is unique about these ruins is that they remained in essentially pristine condition. Of what exists today, only 30% of the total ruins have been restored. 70% is from its original construction by the Incas. Since then, Machu Picchu was declared a Peruvian Historic Sanctuary in 1981 and a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1983. In 2007, Machu Picchu was voted to become one of the new 7 wonders of the world, and now it is one of the most visited tourist sites in the world. If you want to visit these ruins for yourself, I urge you to read our accompanying Machu Picchu blog that was written by Morgan that explains everything you need to know if you want to visit the site. Sure, Machu Picchu is the most famous Peruvian Inca ruin site, but there are many others that still exist today. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into all of these sites in detail because there is still too much to talk about. Before we get into the fall of the great South American empire, I do want to talk about some other technologies that the Incas were developing that even had an impact in today's world. On top of everything that we've discussed thus far, the Incas also designed impressive suspension and pontoon bridges, constructed immense storage houses, and even completed successful brain surgeries. First, let's talk about the bridges. These things were insane. They were not simple at all. They went across canyons and large gorges, and they were built as an integral part of the Inca road system and showcased the true innovation in engineering that was occurring. They were constructed with ichu grass and woven into large bundles to make them stronger. The unfortunate thing is that they needed significant maintenance and would need to be replaced on an annual basis. Next up, their storage houses. It is believed that their ability to store goods was an integral part to the quick empire expansion. The storage buildings were known as kolkas, and they stored everything from food, clothing, to raw materials. Kolkas were part of the Inca system in every village. The goods were accounted for and then would be redistributed among the empire's inhabitants. And finally, our final legacy from the Incas, brain surgeries. Yes, brain surgeries. Inca surgeons commonly and successfully removed small portions of the patient's skull to treat head injuries. The surgical procedure known as trepanation, which I might add is still used today to remove fluid buildup in the brain, was most often performed on adult men. Researchers say it was likely to treat injuries suffered during combat. And a 2018 study showed that the Inca surgeons had developed a detailed knowledge of cranial anatomy. It gets even crazier because in the same study, it was determined that the average survival rate from the surgeries were 75 to 83%. These findings were then compared to the American Civil War, where similar methodology was used, and the average survival rate at the time of the Civil War was only 44 to 54%. These high survival rates during the Inca Empire may be attributed to procedures being performed in open-air environments, the use of herbal medication, and single-use tools. So what happened to the Incas? How did this great empire fall? Well, the answer is easy, right? The Spanish came, conquered them, and with all past civilizations of Peru, someone new took charge and the culture shifted. Done. What else is there to talk about? Well, it's not that simple, and much of their downfall is actually attributed to the civil war that was occurring. That's right. The Inca had so much internal conflict that the downfall was already occurring with or without the Europeans. But there is much more to the story. In 1524 through 1526, the Spaniards under command of Francisco Pizarro were exploring of what is now modern-day Colombia. This small band of 100 soldiers were believed to be carrying many diseases, most notably smallpox. This terrible viral disease wasn't effectively eradicated until 1979, and as it was for South America in the 1500s, this disease had never existed to them. So after European arrival, mass epidemics with all kinds of new diseases spread like wildfire through the indigenous people. The idea that was taught to us as children that Americas were mostly empty and just waiting to be occupied by Europeans is just categorically false. Here's an attempt to put this next explanation into perspective on how deadly these diseases were. At the time of European arrival to the Americas in the late 1400s, there were estimates that the state had a total population that could have been anywhere from 30 million to 100 million inhabitants across both continents. In 1542, a Spanish historian and explorer had even noted that the Americas were so thick in people that it looked like as if God placed the greater part of the entire human race in these countries. Okay, now that we're on the same page, remember earlier when we discussed at the height of the Inca Empire in the early 1500s that the population could have been nearly 10 million subjects? Well, estimates show us that 20% of the Inca Empire was lost to smallpox and other diseases by 1531. That is a loss of 2 million people in a matter of 5 to 10 years. You'd be crazy to think that this alone wouldn't have crippled a growing civilization. And here's the other contributing part to the downfall of the Inca Empire: the rising contention of one another and the start of a civil war. The Inca Civil War is also known as the War of the Two Brothers, which was fought between Huascar and Atahualpa, both sons of Huana Capac. Obviously, they were fighting over the succession of the throne. It began in 1529 and lasted until 1532. So how does this Dance of the Dragon origin story go? Well, it starts off with the eldest son and the original heir to Huana Capac contracting smallpox and dying. This had left the Inca Empire without the obvious choice to fulfill the throne. And this raised many questions among the people. It was uncertain who should be the next emperor. And as it went with the Targaryens, The current ruler was just attempting to maintain peace and hold the empire together. But then he also unfortunately dies of a disease, again in this case smallpox, and on his deathbed he names Huascar emperor. This was not a satisfying answer for Atahualpa, who believed himself to be the rightful heir. Huascar was supported by the nobility in Cusco and also by the religious and political authorities. He was considered the eldest living son and pure-blood Inca because his parents were both siblings. Unfortunately for the empire, he was described as ill-tempered, suspicious, and disrespectful of laws and Inca customs. As it went for Atahualpa, his mother was born outside the royal family, but he had much support in the north. He was described as well-tempered and carried himself with royal dignity. Atahualpa had much more military experience and allegedly was cunning and had early wisdom. But the nobles considered him to be illegitimate, and Huascar felt that it was an insult that a man he considered to be a bastard was even considered for Inca emperor. So Huascar eventually became king, and he believed that Atahualpa should not have any more land and that he should pay homage to him. When Atahualpa sent his captains to Cusco to swear allegiance with many gifts in gold and silver, Huascar refused and killed the messengers, and as expected, Atahualpa declared war against his brother. Okay, so I'm not gonna lie, I'm completely fascinated with this story and can only picture Game of Thrones characters in my head while I'm doing this research. And I love Game of Thrones, so I'm going to continue to go into further detail on this war of the two brothers. After 3 main Inca generals from the north transferred their allegiance to Atahualpa, he gathered his soldiers, claimed what is present-day Quito, Ecuador, as the new capital of the Incan Empire. And then he planned to go south to Cusco and execute his brothers. Rebellions were occurring throughout the entire empire now, proclaiming that Atahualpa is the rightful heir. From the decimation from the smallpox epidemic and the need for all the men for war, all construction on cities like Machu Picchu and the imperial expansion had halted, and Huascar moved his army north for an attack. From 1531 to 1532, both armies had fought many battles. And as I frame this story thus far, I find myself clearly rooting for Atahualpa. But let me tell you, this guy was ruthless. In early battle, his men executed Huascar's main general and he used his skull as a drinking chalice. Atahualpa continued to move south and massacred any opponents who stood in his way. He won every battle on his way south to Cusco. And in 1532, Huascar was captured and Atahualpa had won the war. And very convenient that at this time of the capture, the Spaniards arrived to Peru. And imagine this, the conquistadors left South America in 1526 knowing there was a great empire with millions of subjects. So they returned with many military personnel, expecting a very difficult war. But when they returned in 1532 to conquer the land in South America for themselves, you can imagine their surprise to find a very crippled civilization where millions have died and there was an ongoing civil war amongst the rulers. It's just what they needed. Some historians have even gone as far as to say that if the Incas didn't suffer from the spread of smallpox, that it is very likely that there never would have been a civil war and that the Incas would have easily won the war against the Spanish conquistadors. Unfortunately for Atahualpa's fate, he may have been a little too forgiving for the Spanish arrival because when he heard of the news of the Spanish arriving in Peru shortly before his victory over his brother, he took the information as a good omen on ending the war. This is because he believed in the Inca legend that one day their god creator would return in the form of a man dressed in gold and silver with a white beard from the oceans, but would only return in times of great need. When the northern indigenous people saw the arrival of the Spaniards, who had characteristics similar to their legend, the northern people told Atahualpa that the Spaniards were gods, given their white skin, their beards, their shining armor, and that they had come in great ships from the Pacific Ocean. So at the time of the final battle amongst brothers and recently declared victor, Atahualpa, before he could even leave the city, the new king encountered the conquistador Francisco Pizarro, and Atahualpa was captured by the Spaniards. Pizarro had the decision that both brothers would be brought together, and Pizarro shall determine who was the better Inca. In response to this news, Atahualpa's men, who weren't captured, killed Huascar, and Pizarro was very displeased with Atahualpa at this point. It is said that the Inca pleaded for his life by promising endless precious metals for the Spaniards. Pizarro was pleased to hear this because we all know how the Spanish loved their gold and silver. Within months, the Spaniards were receiving countless shipments of gold from the remaining Incas. Well, actually a total sum of 1,300,000 gold pesos and 51,000 silver marks. But this didn't matter for Atahualpa's fate, because in 1533 the Spaniards tried him for the crimes for the disobeyment of Pizarro and for ordering the death of his brother Huascar. Atahualpa was found guilty and publicly executed. Though we have been talking about the Inca Empire for quite some time now, the empire proved to be relatively short-lived. It is unknown how many Inca died in the span of 10 years that led up to 1533, but between the smallpox epidemic, the Civil War, and the Spanish conquest, it is the belief that there's a population decline of 95%. And just like that, conquerors became the conquered, marking the next chapter of Peru. Among some indigenous peoples of Peru today, it is believed that Atahualpa will return one day to govern them justly and give them well-being. This belief is known as the myth of Incardi, and the belief is that one day Atahualpa will return to restore order to the Andean world broken by the Spanish invasion. We're going to pick up where we left off. The year is 1533. The Spanish have essentially declared rule over what is present-day Peru and many other parts of South America as well. But to continue this podcast, we are going to stick to talking about Peru. The Spanish have effectively defeated the indigenous Incas, although defeat mostly implies that there was an unwanted loss in battle, but actually there wasn't much of a battle for this conquest. Many of the smaller villages and groups of Peru, of whom were being ruled by the Incas, welcomed the Spanish invaders as liberators. This mostly backfired for the indigenous people's legacy of what was still remaining, that is, but we'll get into that later. Honestly, starting off, the Spanish rule for most people was not too different from the Inca rulers. The indigenous people were being exploited for their labor, but now the Spanish were reaping the benefit. So who was Francisco Pizarro? Well, he was a Spanish explorer and obviously later a conqueror. He first arrived to the Americas in 1502 near present-day Nicaragua and later returned in 1516. He was part of the initial Spanish expedition that discovered, and I use the term discovered lightly here, the Pacific Ocean. Over the next years, he aligned himself closely with the other Spanish conquistadors who were already occupying parts of Central America and northern Colombia. He learned from them and eventually received approval from the Spanish crown to proceed with his own conquest of Peru. After the execution of Inca Atahualpa, Pizarro imposed himself as the new leader of the land and conquered present-day Cusco to establish a Spanish democracy. But not without the help of various local indigenous rebels, the same rebels who had worked alongside the Spanish to share the whereabouts of Atahualpa and to plot the ambush and capture of him at the end of the Inca Civil War. Pizarro was appointed governor by the Spanish crown of this vast land. Unfortunately, I don't think the indigenous people had too much vote on this one, but Pizarro then decided that they would move the capital from Cusco to present-day Lima. This offered the Spaniards better access to the seaports and assured their lasting relations and control of this newfound colony. He personally led the construction efforts, and the new city was founded in 1535. It was named Ciudad de los Reyes, in English, City of the Kings. The Spanish colonial rule over Peru occurred nearly for the next 300 years, 1534 until 1824. But all wasn't perfect for the Spanish. As they were moving more and more people and resources into the country, there was a revolt being planned by the new Inca ruler, Manco Inca Yupanqui. Manco Inca was the younger brother to Huascar and was originally installed as a puppet Inca leader by Pizarro himself, who would follow the Spanish order. Between the indigenous revolts and the Spanish unable to effectively lead the new territory, it was a difficult period to have any forward mobility. It is said that history repeats itself, but unfortunately in this case, the mirror of events happened much sooner than later. Right when the Inca Civil War finished, the Spanish decided to have a civil war of their own. Therefore, this delayed the official creation of the Spanish colonial government in Peru. Two conquistadors couldn't decide on who shall rule this new territory. On one side was Pizarro and his men, and the other was Diego de Almagro. Almagro was the first Spaniard to arrive in present-day Chile and was one of the early conquistadors that Pizarro had learned from in Central America. He partnered with Pizarro on overtaking the Inca Empire, but both claimed themselves as the official Spanish representation and wanted the natural riches of the land for themselves. This led to the Battle of Las Salinas, a short bloody fight which led to the success of Pizarro. Almagro was executed in July of 1538. And just a short 3 years later, Pizarro was assassinated by Almagro's son. So with all of this internal conflict, the new colony was effectively in turmoil and had no direction. Nonetheless, it was officially marked as Spanish territory in 1542, and the government was named Viceroyalty of Peru. Viceroyalty is just another word for Spanish colony. This landmass was massive and actually covered much more than present-day Peru. It encompassed a territory that was even larger than the Inca Empire. The land included modern-day Venezuela, Panama, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, Paraguay, Uruguay, most of Argentina, and even some of western Brazil. Due to the supporters of Pizarro and Almagro continuing to fight amongst one another, and the new attacks from the Incas, there was no real order or control until 1569. In 1569 is when Francisco Alvarez de Toledo came along. He was considered the first Spaniard who brought imperial order to the viceroyalty. Though organized he was every bit of a tyrant as they come. He implemented the frameworks into the government that still have effects in modern-day Peru's culture, of which include a detailed taxing system and developing a census process to determine the total population of indigenous and Europeans living in the viceroyalty. Now in 1571, the first time in history, there was an official record of Peru's human and natural resources. But these implementations seem pretty good, even in terms for the modern world. Was he that bad? And unfortunately, yes. Yes, he was. He also structured the first major exploitation efforts of the indigenous people for the royal crown. And the Spaniards relocated and displaced many indigenous people for the sole purpose of opening more silver mines. They were effectively used as slave labor. Though this converted Peru into one of the most important centers of silver production in the world, all of the riches were going to the Spanish crown. So now the Spaniards have established their official territory here, but even with the dramatic decrease in indigenous population, the Incas were continuing to fight the Spanish for their land. At this time in history, it was 1572, and the Incas were mostly a neo-Inca state. They were only a shell of what was once the greatest empire in the Americas. The lead Incas had fled Cusco and were living among the more remote parts of the Amazon rainforest. When Alvarez caught word that there was a new Inca ruler without the permission of the crown, he took it upon himself to declare one final war on the Incas. Tupac Amaru Inca was captured, and upon his execution in Cusco, he spoke his final words to all the indigenous people. Pachacamac, witness how my enemies shed my blood. And with that, all final remnants of the original Inca Empire now officially ceased to exist. As we mentioned earlier, the Spanish colonial rule lasted from 1534 into the 1820s. We know that this exerted a profound and destructive impact on the lives of Peru's indigenous people. But unlike other parts of Mesoamerica and North America, the conquest of the Andes didn't result in the complete eradication of indigenous lives. Even through the worst of plagues, conquests, and exploitation, the indigenous people managed to survive all the way through modern-day Peru. But as we already know, in early years of the viceroyalty, there had been a significant decrease in indigenous population, almost a 90% reduction since their height. But with the Europeans' thirst for more silver and gold, there was a labor shortage in Peru that needed to be filled. And I think everyone can see where this dark history is going to go. The Spanish turned to the Portuguese-led African slave trade, and they began bringing Africans to Peru to work in the mineral mines and other agricultural tasks for the Spanish territory. Despite the fact that the African slaves were originally intended for mining and agricultural labor, it was common for European owners to send the slaves to work in the cities, where they worked in various trades, which could range from being street vendors or indentured servants. Though the conditions for the indigenous and enslaved Africans were difficult to say the least, this practice fostered the birth for a new society in which the indigenous, Spanish descendants, and Africans all merged to give rise to new traditions of what would later become independent Peru. And economically speaking, Peru continued to grow for the next couple of hundred of years. Exploitation of labor tends to help with that. The emergence of the large-scale silver mining operations and further development of cities like Lima helped it become a powerhouse colony for the crown. But as it went for most European territories, the Spanish began to lose more and more control throughout the 18th century. With further Spanish involvement in South America, industry and growth had moved to more favorable locations. Ports made more sense to be developed in present-day Panama and Buenos Aires, and present-day Colombia had more gold. In an attempt to not concentrate all of the power with one territory, the Spaniards decided that they would need to break up the viceroyalty of Peru into smaller regions. In 1717, the viceroyalty of Nueva Granada was created, of which was made up of modern-day Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, and Panama. And later, in the same year that the United States signed for their own independence from Great Britain, the viceroyalty of Peru was under the Second Reorganization, where it dismembered another vast region. This led to the creation of the Viceroyalty of Del Rio de la Plata, of which was made up of modern-day Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Bolivia. The loss of these regions meant loss of power for Peru, but it continued to be a valuable asset to the crown due to its political, social, and cultural influence. But now, the territory's size more closely reflects modern-day Peru. For Spain to maintain their power while being thousands of miles away, they needed to rely on local elite to govern the indigenous people. But Peru was unique in its development because all of the local elites still took much pride in their indigenous culture. This cultural influence bled over to later Spanish descendants, and their two cultures integrated into one another. The Spaniards were wedding indigenous people, and the native heritage continued to actually grow. This led to even further resentment among the people towards the Spanish rule. Multiple indigenous revolts occurred over the latter half of the 18th century. They ultimately failed, but the first was led by Juan Santos Atahualpa. The mixture of the Spanish and Incan names here does not go unmissed by me either. Juan led the effort to remove 23 Christian missionaries from the Amazon basin of Peru. Though this effort was very successful, and his men then attempted to march on to Cusco to overthrow the Spanish governor, it ultimately ended in a failed attack. Then Juan disappeared in 1752 to never be heard from again. The second major rebellion was led by Tupac Amaru II, a self-proclaimed Inca who led a fairly large rebellion in 1780. After winning several battles and taking the lives of thousands of Spaniards along the way, Tupac was captured and executed. To assure this wouldn't happen again, the Spanish executed his entire family. With people learning about the United States independence and the restructuring of Spain from the attacks by Napoleon, these local attacks from Juan and Tupac Amaru didn't go unnoticed by other indigenous tribes and dissatisfied Spanish descendants across South America. Uprisings and revolts were occurring all over the place: Ecuador, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, and more times in Peru. The times and sentiment were surely changing. And then in 1810, something big happened that changed the course of South American history for the next century. Colombia was the first South American country that declared independence from Spain. With several wars fought, Chile followed suit in 1818, and then in 1820, several towns in Peru were claiming independence for themselves, but had not yet made a unified cause for the country. And this is where two men come into history: Simon Bolivar and Jose de San Martin. And let me tell you, their legacy lives on today, very favorably I might add. You can't go to a city in South America and not find a plaza or memorial that is not named after these guys. Jose de San Martin was a military man and politician from Argentina. He was one of the key figures in Argentina's, Chile's, and Peru's independence. By military man, I don't mean that lightly. His father served in the military for Spain, and as did he, when his own career began at the age of 11, where he was named cadet. For the next 20 years, he participated in 17 different wars for Spain and continued to rise in ranks. In 1811, he gave up his military career as he caught word for the liberation movements in Argentina. He then moved back to South America to support the cause. With all of his military expertise, he embarked on moving his independent army to Huaca, Peru in 1820. The viceroy proposed diplomatic negotiations, which ultimately failed because San Martin's final proposal was the independence of Peru. Due to increased tensions, the viceroy abandoned Lima in 1821, and the city's gates were open to San Martin. He led his efforts to implement a new independent Congress in Lima. While San Martin was occupying Lima, he proclaimed the independence of Peru on July 28, 1821, and he spoke the words, "From this moment on, Peru is free and independent, by the general will of all of the people and the justice of its cause that God defends. Long live the homeland, long live freedom, long live our independence." San Martin received the title of Protector of the Peruvian Freedom in August of 1821, after supporting and co-leading these efforts in Peru for their independence from Spain. And on the other hand, we have Simon Bolivar. He was also a military man and politician. He was from Venezuela and of Spanish descent. He led several campaigns that led to the independence of multiple American nations. He stood out as the leading figure for the Spanish-American emancipation against the Spanish Empire. For his actions, he was awarded the title of El Libertador for his independence actions in Venezuela. These two men, San Martin and Bolivar, met in 1822 to discuss the fates of Peru's independence. San Martin opted for a constitutional monarchy, whilst Bolivar favored a republic. Nonetheless, they both followed the notion that Peru should be independent from Spain. Shortly after this meeting, San Martin's wife became ill and he decided it was time to retire. In 1822, he left his post and moved back to Argentina to live out his days. Bolivar was then requested to attend a congressional meeting in Peru in 1823. The day after his arrival, the self-made Congress granted him supreme authority in the country. Within the year, he was effectively named dictator of Peru. Bolivar was officially on the path to help lead Peru to a true independence. Bolivar went on to expand Peru's independent military in attempts to defeat the remaining Spanish control, who were still occupying all of the Andean and northern regions of the country. Multiple battles occurred throughout 1824, all leaving Bolivar's military as the victor. And finally, the Battle of Ayacucho. This was the last major confrontation that put an end to the Spanish occupation in Peru. The war began on December 9th, 1824, but would not officially end for another 2 years. Finally, in 1826, the final victory from the Patriots meant the complete withdrawal of all royalist military that were still standing and sealed the independence of Peru. The Republican era of Peru is usually considered to begin after the Declaration of Independence or the initial Battle of Ayacucho in 1824. 2 years later, in 1826, Bolivar embarked on his new path towards Colombia. Before leaving, he ensured the validity of the Constitution and the Congress in Peru, but Bolivar never returned to the country. During the initial Republic era of Peru, there was a period where several military figures held control of the country, starting in 1827 with Jose de la Mar's presidency. Spain continued to make futile attempts to regain its former colonies, such as the Battle of Callao in 1866, but all attempts ended in failure. It wasn't until 1879 that Spain finally recognized the Peruvian independence by signing the Peru Peace Treaty in Paris. Okay, now that we're here, this country can end all of these wars and keep moving forward, right? They have their freedom, more rights for the indigenous people, and now they can just rebuild and grow, right? Apparently not. And my gosh, while doing the research for this recently, all that I've been reading about was battles, internal conflicts, and war. So of course it doesn't stop here. Right when this country gets their own independence from Spain, they immediately begin a war with Bolivia. Peru's new government saw it as a disadvantage being surrounded by Bolivia, so they invaded the country in 1828, and this led to further conflicts with Colombia, which led to another war in 1829. And yet again, there was another civil war in 1834, where northern Peru and southern Peru disagreed on the leader and direction of the country. This led to the establishment of the Peru-Bolivian Confederation, which of course led to another war. Many Peruvian exiles, as well as the neighboring countries Chile and Argentina, opposed the existence of this new state. In 1839, after the end of the War of the Confederation, the states of Peru and Bolivia were reestablished as independent and separate from each other. And I'm just getting exhausted at this point. With all of these military regimes, these countries continuing to fight, bringing upon new wars and conflicts for their own territorial expansions for the next 100 years. It's so unfortunate because people are just trying to get ahead and live their lives, but this country is being led by endless military dictatorships that just keep getting involved with endless wars. Seriously, it doesn't stop. In reality, this country is still trying to figure itself out. It hasn't stopped since 1827, 200 years of coups, new military regimes put in power, the implementation of communism, widespread terrorism and drug trafficking, economic hardship, and hyperinflation. The amount of suffering here that has occurred over the last 200 years is incomprehensible. It wasn't until 2001 where the Toledo administration managed to restore some degree of democracy into the country. This government was following a complete authoritarianism regime that was plagued with widespread corruption. Then President Toledo made significant cabinet changes in response to the previous scandals. But due to the economic hardships and significant protests, in May of 2003, Toledo declared a state of emergency that suspended civil liberties and gave the military power to enforce order in 12 regions of Peru. The political division continues into today, as we discussed at the very beginning of this podcast. And here we are today. Peru is technically a constitutional republic with a president, 2 vice presidents, a prime minister, a Congress, and a Supreme Court, very similar to how the United States government is outlined. But Peruvians are required to vote by law from the age of 18 until 70. Their presidents serve a 5-year term and can only be elected twice in a row. Peru is the 19th largest country in the world and is the 3rd largest in South America. It is one of the richest countries in the world in terms of natural resources. Gold, silver, copper, zinc, lead, and iron are all found across the country, and there are reserves of oil and natural gas. Even with all of this, jobs can be very hard to find, and Peru remains one of the world's poorest countries. Peru is considered an emerging social market. It has the 47th largest economy in the world by total GDP and currently experiences high human development index. The country was one of the world's fastest growing economies in 2012, where the GDP growth was at a rate of 6.3%. Their major sectors included agriculture, fishing, and mining. The main agriculture production is of avocado, blueberries, artichokes, and asparagus. They are an international leader in fishing, producing nearly 10% of the world's fish catch. And mining is a major pillar for the Peruvian economy. In 2019, the country was the 2nd largest world producer of copper and silver and the 8th largest world producer of gold. And now that we know that there's still promise for economic growth in the country, I can't end this podcast on sadness and chaos because, as we already discussed, who really matters here and who really represents Peru? It is the people. The people who have indigenous pride, Spanish heritage, and African roots. The people who didn't get to have a voice throughout history because they are just living their everyday ordinary lives. People who have been beholden to the leaders getting into endless wars for territory, status, or power. When you get to witness this country firsthand, you don't see the government, you see the people. The people who have rich mixture of cultures. The people who have suffered and have a tense history. The visual arts of the colonial Andes stand as a testament to the resilience of the native people in the post-conquested world. Native Indians continue to express themselves artistically alongside and in collaboration with the Spanish Mestizo, Criollo, Asian, and African descended peoples. Pre-Columbian and independent Peru artistic traditions cultivated over the course of several millennia, which entered into a dynamic contact with the imported European models to produce stunning and culturally complex works of art. This art is expressed through painting, pottery, architecture, and music, all of which is shared among the people. Today, Peru is modern with global influences, as it is apparent that they are always open to find new trends and are constantly moving and changing in music, art, and literature. Peruvians are very expressive. They use many hand gestures when talking and expect a kiss on the cheek when saying hello and goodbye. It is not uncommon to see many couples showing affection in public places, and as a whole, Peruvians have tremendous respect for elders, people of higher positions at work, skilled professionals, and educated people. So hopefully this podcast sheds some light on the importance of understanding other people's situations and backgrounds. Let's wrap it up. I've been talking for entirely too long at this point. What would I give to actually know the history of Peru? Why the Norte Chico people built their civilization? To understand the fall of the Inca Empire. But not knowing why doesn't diminish the events. We know it did happen, and these people built great architecture, they formed complex societies, and countless battles were fought. Endless people lost their lives for hundreds of years. It is important for us to study and appreciate our human past so that our future leaders don't continue down into the endless wars. We can learn from our past, grow, and be better and more compassionate humans with the goal to make the world a better place. I find it fascinating that the Native American indigenous cultures is not only celebrated but cherished, not only Peru, but all of South America. Of the 32 million people that live in this country today, 60% of the country identifies as having indigenous heritage, and another 10% identify as being full Native American or Quechua. That's 70% of the country having indigenous roots and heritage. So I hope that you have learned something about Peru, and maybe it even inspires you to travel to South America and learn more about these unique cultures. If you do travel here, be sure to do your own research, understand the government guidelines, and only go where you feel that you would be comfortable. If you're interested, we do have more travel guides and blogs on Peru at travelingwhileburials.com, which is linked below. And again, if you're interested in watching our personal travels, we have a 4-part series on YouTube. If you enjoy this podcast, please be sure to rate the show wherever you consume your podcast. And if you want me to do more episodes like this, please share it with your friends and family on social media, and be sure to let me know your thoughts on Instagram, Twitter, or YouTube. I have now spent months on this project, so the more people that can learn and grow from it, the better. Again, thank you for coming along this journey and taking the time to learn with me. This has been a Paper Mountains production by Jacob Welly. Cheers.
Done.